Okay, welcome to Chapter 13, the spinal cord, nerves, and reflexes. This is part of the peripheral nervous system that we'll be talking about. Next week, we'll dive into the central nervous system. So Chapter 14 is the central nervous system. So this chart is showing how when your body picks up sensations by receptors, they send information to the brain, which then sends motor output to cranial nerves for the central nervous system. For the peripheral nervous system, sensory receptors send input to the reflex centers on the spinal cord, and then they send motor output to the spinal nerves. And the effectors for any of these can be muscles, glands, or adipose tissue. So the spinal cord contains 31 pairs of spinal nerves. It's separated by sections just like the spine itself is. The regions of the spinal cord then are named after the same as the regions of the spine. We have the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal spinal nerves. There's the same amount for as many segments of the spine that there are. However, the one exception is the cervical vertebrae, where there's 8 spinal nerves, but only 7 cervical vertebrae, because there is one that exits between C1 and the occiput of the skull. The spinal cord ends at L1, L2. So after that, there are still nerves that travel down into the lower lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal segments. However, they are just in the form of nerves instead of coming off of a spinal cord. So you can see in this graph where the spinal cord ends, these purple nerves, or this purple segment of the spinal cord with the purple nerves coming off of it, all innervate these sacral segments, or exit through the sacrum. So they actually end pretty high up in the lumbar spine. The gross anatomy of the spinal cord, there is a posterior median sulcus. So a sulcus just means where there's a groove in between a section of tissue. There's an anterior median fissure. So a fissure is a little bit deeper than a sulcus, as you can see here. There's a central canal that goes through the middle of the spinal cord. So this is a cross-section of a spinal cord. You can see that this is part of it. This is as if you were to cut it in a transverse segment and then look down at it. So the central canal goes through the middle, and it contains cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, which helps to keep the integrity of the spinal cord. It also provides a little shock absorption. There are 2 enlargements of the spinal cord. There's the cervical enlargement, which supplies sensation to the shoulder and upper limbs. And there's the lumbosacral enlargement, which provides sensation to the pelvis and lower limbs. The bottom of the spinal cord is known as the conus medullaris because where it ends forms a cone shape or a triangular shape. At the end of the conus medullaris is the filum terminale. It's a connective tissue segment where the conus medullaris ends. There's also spinal ganglia. Spinal ganglia contain the bodies of sensory neurons. And then the axons form the dorsal roots. Dorsal or posterior roots. The dorsal roots have sensation, so that's why they contain the bodies of sensory neurons. Ventral roots are the axons of motor neurons. So you'll see that as a theme throughout the spinal cord. Anything that's dorsal is usually for sensation. Anything that's ventral is usually for motor responses. Those roots come together to form rootlets. They pass through the intervertebral foramen, so the space in between vertebrae. At the bottom of the spinal cord, where it ends, those free nerves that are floating in that space are called the cauda equina. It's called that because it's Cauda means horse's tail, and it kind of looks like a horse's tail. The spinal cord enlarges and elongates until about 4 years old, where it's continuously growing at the same pace as the bones of the vertebrae. After that, the spinal cord stops growing, and your body kind of catches up, which is why it ends up ending at about L1, L2 instead of traveling through the bottom of the spinal canal. Spinal nerves, there are mixed nerves, afferent and efferent, meaning that they have both sensory and motor function. There are some named spinal nerves, and usually they're named after what they are innervating or what they do. The white ramus communicans are myelinated spinal nerves. Gray ramus communicans are unmyelinated spinal nerves. The posterior ramus innervates or provides sensory and motor functions for the back, and the anterior ramus provides sensory and motor sensation to the ventrolateral body, so everything else, your thorax, your face, your head, and your limbs. Spinal meninges, so we have cranial and spinal meninges. They are continuous with one another. These are just layers of fibrous, membranous tissue that help to protect both our spinal cord and our brain. It's an extra level of barrier protection from foreign invaders. So, in order from superficial to deep, we have the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. The dura mater forms the outermost covering of the spinal cord. The space above the dura mater is known as the epidural space. So if you were to get an epidural when you're pregnant and giving birth, that's which space you would be given the epidural in. The dura mater fuses with the periosteum of the foramen magnum. It also tapers in the sacral canal and blends with the filum terminale to form the coccygeal ligament, which blends with the coccyx periosteum. For the arachnoid mater, the space underneath the dura mater before the arachnoid mater is called the subdural space, which is a potential space because typically it does not exist unless some trauma occurs and blood fills that space or some other kind of fluid that should not be there. The subarachnoid space is the space below the arachnoid mater, and this is the space where lumbar punctures or spinal taps are taken. So they draw out cerebrospinal fluid from this subarachnoid space to be able to figure out if there are any pathogens free-floating in your CSF. The pia mater is directly continuous with the spinal cord or brain. They also have denticulate ligaments which connect, kind of anchor the pia mater into the spinal cord and the brain, and it helps to prevent lateral movement. Meningitis then would be the inflammation of any of these meninges. So here's a picture of gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is a bunch of unmyelinated tissue. White matter is a bunch of myelinated tissue. So in the middle is your gray matter, and on the outside is the white matter. So it's not necessarily white and gray, but one is lighter than the other. So we have the posterior, lateral, and anterior horns of gray matter, and they are exactly how they sound. They're either posterior, lateral, or anterior. There are also gray commissures, which are narrow bridges of gray matter that surround the central canal, and they are also composed of sensory and motor nuclei. For white matter, it's very similar. There's posterior, lateral, and anterior white columns. There's also anterior white commissures, which are, again, bridges. A tract is a bundle of axons in the central nervous system. So the ascending tract is sensory information that's going to the brain, and the descending tract is motor information that's going to the spinal cord. As far as the spinal nerve is concerned, epineurium covers the entire nerve itself. Perineurium will cover fascicles of neurons. Endoneurium will cover each individual neuron, and there is an extensive blood supply to spinal nerves arteries, veins, capillaries, you name it. Peripheral nerves are nerves that branch off of spinal nerves to innervate other parts of your body. And the recovery from injury of spinal nerves depends on the extent of the injury. As you know, nervous tissue does not regenerate very easily, so it can be difficult for nerves to recover from injury, but if it's going to happen peripherally, is its best chance. So if you damage a peripheral nerve, that's your best chance of recovery. If it's something that's closer to the spine, it's usually much less likely to recover fully. Dermatomes are bilateral regions of skin surface that are monitored by a single pair of spinal nerves. So you can see on this chart which nerves innervate which spots of skin. So on the left it shows anterior, on the right it shows posterior. This is really clinically important for peripheral neuropathies. So if there are any diseases that cause differences in sensation in any of these planes, you kind of can figure out which nerve you're working with. Nerve plexuses are larger bundles of nerves that branch off of these spinal nerves. There are 4 main plexuses: cervical plexus, brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, and sacral plexus. The cervical plexus is composed of the anterior rami of C1 through C5. It innervates the muscles of the neck and thoracic cavity, specifically the diaphragm is the most important one, and that's innervated by the phrenic nerve. The brachial plexus innervates the pectoral girdle and upper limb from anterior rami of C5 through T1. In the brachial plexus, you'll see trunks, which are large bundles of axons, and the branches off of them, which are cords. Some of the main nerves of the brachial plexus are the musculocutaneous nerve, the ulnar nerve, median nerve, radial nerve, and axillary nerve. We also have the lumbar plexus, which is composed of anterior rami from T12 to L4. Some of the major nerves there are the genitofemoral nerve, lateral femoral cutaneous nerve, and the femoral nerve. The sacral plexus is composed of the anterior rami of L4 through S4. And the main nerves there are sciatic nerve, pudendal nerve, common fibular nerve, and tibial nerve. We also have interneurons, which far outnumber regular neurons. So there are 10 million sensory neurons, 500,000 motor neurons, but 20 billion interneurons. Interneurons are just the place where sensory and motor neurons meet, how they converge to share information. Neuronal pools are functional groups of interconnected neurons. And there are 5 main ways that they can interconnect and communicate. The first is divergence, where there's this spread of information from one neuron to many neurons. There's convergence, where several neurons synapse on a single postsynaptic neuron. There's serial processing, where it's a stepwise pattern of one neuron spreading information to another neuron and so on, kind of like a game of telephone. There's parallel processing, which is when several neurons process the same information simultaneously. And there's reverberation, where collateral branches extend backwards to stimulate presynaptic neurons. It's kind of like a positive feedback loop. Reflexes are rapid and automatic responses to stimuli. There's a receptor, control center, and effector, kind of like at the beginning when we talked about negative feedback. There's a reflex arc that is a quick pathway between sensory and motor neurons. And with negative feedback and how it relates to reflexes, generally the response removes or opposes the original stimulus, and that's what makes it negative feedback. And a stretch reflex is a very basic type of reflex you may have seen, especially if you've ever had your reflexes tested at the doctor's office when you were a kid and they did the patellar reflex where they hit your knee with an instrument and you kicked your leg out. That's a stretch reflex. It's a very quick response to a stretching of the tendon. So there are 5 main steps for a reflex. First is the arrival of a stimulus and activation of the receptor. Then the sensory neuron is activated. Information is then processed in the central nervous system. The motor neurons are activated, and then there's a response by the effector. Reflexes can be classified by development, nature of resulting motor response, complexity of neural circuit, and the site of information processing. Reflexes can either be innate or acquired. Innate reflexes usually disappear with age. Oftentimes these are called primitive reflexes. But some reflexes can be modified or suppressed with conscious effort. Motor responses can also be somatic or visceral. Somatic meaning from the body or the skeletal muscle, visceral meaning from the organs. And these can lower your likelihood of injury, as, for example, if you were to touch something sharp, you would have a quick withdrawal reflex and be able to keep yourself from being too injured. Reflexes can also be monosynaptic or polysynaptic. Monosynaptic is when a sensory neuron directly innervates a motor neuron, and this usually results in a very quick response. Polysynaptic reflexes tend to be a little bit more complex, and we'll talk about those in just a second. So the stretch reflex, or one of the most common stretch reflexes, the patellar reflex, is a really good example of a monosynaptic reflex. A sensory neuron causes a motor response. Muscle spindles are the sensory receptors in a stretch reflex. There are intrafusal muscle fibers and extrafusal muscle fibers, being that intrafusal means inside the spindle, extrafusal surrounding the spindle, and the gamma motor neurons that they refer to here are the motor neurons that innervate the intrafusal fibers. We also have postural reflexes that help to maintain an upright posture. These are constantly working to make sure that you stay upright. They have stretch reflexes and polysynaptic reflexes, and they tend to be pretty complex, being that they have to maintain a firm muscle tone in order to work. And these have extremely sensitive stretch receptors, and that if you start leaning forward a little too much, you might have some muscles fire up in your back to keep you upright, and so on. With polysynaptic reflexes, like I said, they tend to be more complicated. They can be excitatory or inhibitory. We have tendon reflexes, which the sensory receptor for that is the Golgi tendon organ. Tendon reflexes monitor external tension, and they prevent tendons from tearing. So they do tend to be a little bit more complex. Withdrawal reflexes are also considered polysynaptic. These can be flexor reflexes, where you draw your arm or a limb or something closer to your body in an effort to prevent harm to yourself. Reciprocal inhibition typically occurs with this, where if you flex one muscle in a withdrawal reflex, usually its opposing muscle relaxes, and it has to in order for that to occur. Reflex arcs can be ipsilateral or contralateral, meaning ipsilateral means body on the same side, contralateral means on the opposite side. So you may have muscles respond on the same side of your body or opposite sides of your body to take part in these withdrawal reflexes or other polysynaptic reflexes. Polysynaptic reflexes often involve pools of interneurons, more than one spinal segment, reciprocal inhibition, reverberating current, reverberating circuits that prolong reflexive response, and they may cooperate to perform a coordinated controlled response. Reinforcement is the enhancement of spinal reflexes. Inhibition would be the opposite, the inhibition of spinal reflexes, trying to slow them down or prevent them from occurring. An example of a reflex that disappears with age is the plantar reflex. Or rather, it doesn't disappear, but our response to it changes. So the plantar reflex You often hear it called the Babinski reflex. The better term for it is the plantar reflex. So if you take something sharp-ish and run it up the length of your foot from your heel to your toes, right down the center, as an adult, your toes will curl. If you're to do this on a baby, their toes will splay outwards. It's called an upgoing toe reflex. The kid's response to this is called the Babinski reflex. So that upgoing toe sign is Babinski. Plantar reflex is when you curl your toes. Sometimes adults will not have a plantar reflex, and that's completely normal. But if adults have a Babinski reflex and that reflex never went away, that can be a sign of a central nervous system issue.